Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a duping the vibes video. I am going to be attempting to dupe all of the shades from the ColourPop and Twilight eyeshadow palette. I was intrigued by the palette, and when I saw the release photos, I figured I probably had enough blue and green shades in my collection to where I might not need to pick it up. So I decided not to purchase it, but from what I understand, it sold out within like 3 minutes on the ColourPop website, and people are waiting for the ColourPop website to restock and also for the release on the Ulta website. So for those of you who are waiting for the palette to come back or couldn't get your hands on it, or for those of you who are like me and don't necessarily want to pick up the palette but might have been intrigued by the color story, I'm hoping that this video might be helpful. I did put up a poll on my community tab about the kind of content that you all would like to see more of from me in 2024, and duping the vibes was the second highest response that I received after multiple looks from one palette. So I'm excited to be back at my little desk here and attempting to dupe a brand new palette release for you. I wish you could see what my desk looks like right now. I've got about 1,000 palettes in front of me. I've got a pen and paper to help me keep track of all the different shades and all the different palettes. I think it's fun to challenge myself to try and find exact dupes or dupes that are really close in the palettes that I already have. Obviously that's not necessary. If you just take inspiration from a palette and pull out any old blue and green palette, that is also duping the vibes. But for me, it's more about the challenge of seeing what I already have. So I'll try and have a timestamp down below if you're not interested in seeing my duping process and you just kind of want to skip ahead to see the look that I create. I've got a different eye look on now because I was filming something else, but I figured I would leave it on for this part of the video while I'm kind of doing the duping process, and then I'll take it off and use my dupe palette to create an eye look that is inspired by the Twilight collection. So if that sounds good, just keep on watching. I am going to pull up my reference photos for swatches, and I have to say not that many people have the palette yet, so there aren't that many options for swatches to pull from. I will link in the description box the people whose photos I'm drawing from, and then I'm also going to be looking at the ColourPop swatches on their website along with the photos of the palette itself. It's always hard with the brand's photos because I feel like a lot of times they don't accurately reflect the undertones of the shades or the saturation of the shades, but we're just going to do the best we can today because yeah, I'm just working with what I have. So I am looking at the photos of the palette now, and there's a definite kind of theme going on. It's mostly blue with a few greens thrown in and a couple of neutral shades. So looking for a lot of really icy, like silvery blue tones, some duochrome blue to periwinkle tones. There's a couple of greens, there's a couple of neutral shades, sort of taupey-ish neutral shades, and then a sparkly black. So I think what I'm going to do is just start from the top left corner of the palette, and I'm just going to start opening up palettes and seeing what I have that might be close. All right, so the shade Edward is a shimmer, and it looks like it has a lot of silver in it, but it's not a true silver shimmer. There also is one of those, which is called Prom Night, but Edward is definitely leaning a little bit more blue. So I'm gonna open up the palette that I always tend to reach for when I'm duping the vibes of something. I'll roll up my sleeves here so we can start swatching. This is the Beauty Bay and Jade Thorough Wall palette, and this is 42 shades, so it's always a really great reference palette when I am trying to dupe other palettes that have released. And the shade that I'm looking at here is the shade Confetti, which looks like a silver in some lights, but it does have a good amount of blue to it, and it is a really glittery, shimmery, impactful shimmer shade. Here's what that shade looks like just swatched on my finger. That looks pretty close to the type of shade that I'm seeing in the ColourPop palette. Here's what that looks like on my arm. It's definitely a little bit sheerer than what I'm seeing in the swatch, but the swatches are actually kind of sheer as well. I think I'm actually going to take that as a dupe because I don't think I'm going to get much closer than that in my collection. So first one down. While I'm making my notes here, I will just tell you that I know a lot of people had a lot of opinions about this palette and the color story. I think it's a really pretty blue-green color story, but in terms of the like debate over whether it accurately captures the spirit of Twilight or whatever, I don't have an opinion on that really. I know a lot of people did. Don't kill me, but I actually don't know that much about Twilight. But my friend group growing up definitely did. Like I was in middle school when a lot of people were reading the books, and then I was in high school when the movies came out. Only read the first book and seen the first movie, don't kill me. But yeah, there's not really as much at stake for me in the color story that ColourPop chose as there is for some other people who are like the diehard fans. So totally respect that. If you are a huge Twilight fan, I would love to hear in the comments down below what you thought about the choice of the color story. Let us know in the comments down below. Next up, we have the shade Unconditionally, which is a matte. It looks like a really pretty, just like matte sky blue, maybe with a touch of periwinkle to it, but it is really, really light. So I'm opening up a couple of palettes here. Like this shade in the BH Blueberry Muffin palette is a really nice periwinkle matte, but I think that's gonna be too dark. A lot of the like lighter blue mattes that I have, I think are gonna be too dark for this shade. Another really great reference palette, I think, for this is gonna be the Michaela and Glamlight. Is this the part 2? I think this is the part 2 palette because this one is like all greens and blues with the exception of some purples. So I was thinking of this shade right here, No Harsh Lines, but I think even that's gonna be a little dark. So I'm gonna try this shade from the Beauty Bay and Nikki Tutorials palette called Plot Twist. It's still that periwinkle, like sky blue vibe, but it's light. It's really, really light. It's got a lot of like white in it. Here's what that looks like on my finger. I can't think of another shade that I have in my palette collection that is both a sky blue and a really, really light shade. So I think I'm gonna go with that one for Unconditionally. And then we've got the shade Prom Night, which is another shimmer, and this one looks like much more of a true silver shimmer shade. Pretty light still. There's not a lot of like gray in it at all. I'm thinking perhaps this shade from the ColourPop of the Mandalorian palette. This one here called Beskar Steel. Star Wars is another one I don't really know anything about. So I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. There's also one in the Odin's Eye Christmas Eve palette called Snowflake, which is this one right here, which looks like it might have a little bit more of a flaky texture than what I'm looking for. So let's swatch both of those together. So this one is the one from Odin's Eye and this one is the one from ColourPop. I have to say, if it were me, like I prefer the one from Odin's Eye just because it's just so much more metallic and impactful. But from what I can tell from the swatches of the one from the ColourPop, it isn't quite that flaky. So I think I'm gonna go for the one from the ColourPop Mandalorian palette and just kind of keep it in the family of the ColourPop silvers that they have made in other palettes. And I feel like it'll be pretty close. So here is what that silver shade is looking like, and here is our color story so far. The next shade coming up is an exciting one. So I'm looking at the shade Immortal, which looks like it almost might be like a Super Shock texture. It's sort of like a blue to purpley, periwinkly duochrome with a lot of silver to it. The only thing that might be an issue with this is that there are 3 shades that are kind of like that in this palette. So we have Immortal, and then we have the Cullens, which is a blue to purple or purple to blue duochrome that's really close, but the duochrome definitely shines more blue than silver. And then we have the shade Irresistible, which is again, it's sort of like a navy blue to silver duochrome. So there are going to be some pretty similar shades. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to find dupes for all of these, but let's just take a look and see what we can do. So starting with the shade Immortal, that's the one that has more of a bright silvery duochrome to it. I'm thinking potentially this shade from the Glamlight and Barbie Summer Dreams palette. It's called Born Ready. Also another one in this palette called Superstar, which I'll swatch. It's a tad deeper, but it's also a purple to blue duochrome. And then also in the Glamlight and Scooby-Doo Rutro Raggy palette, there are two purple to blue duochromes in here as well. So I'm going to swatch both of those and just get a little selection going on the back of my hand here so we can kind of dig into all the differences between these. It's kind of tough because they all look somewhat similar in the pan and you don't really know what they're going to be like until you swatch them. There's also this one from the Moira I'm Falling For You palette called Still Falling. I'm going to go ahead and swatch that one too. Okay, so here's a few of my blue to purple duochrome shades. I think right off the bat, a lot of these are looking too warm. This is definitely a very silvery blue to purple duochrome that we're looking for. So I'm thinking this one here, which was from the Glamlight and Barbie palette, the first one that I swatched, called Born Ready. I think that one's going to be our best bet for the shade Immortal. And the rest of these don't quite fit in with any of the other blue to purple duochrome shades either. So we might have to go back to the drawing board for these other ones, but I think for now, until I find something that has a little bit more of a deeper blue base to it, I'm gonna stick with this shade Born Ready for the dupe for Immortal. Okay, and then believe it or not, we have another silver. So I just looked for a silver for the shade Prom Night, and this shade Ice Cold looks a little bit lighter and brighter than that other shade that we chose for Prom Night. So now I'm kind of rethinking my silver choices because I had looked at another one from the Odin's Eye Christmas Eve palette. Maybe this one should have been the deeper of the two. Yeah, so I think we'll switch those around. So I will do, for Prom Night, I will do the shade from the ColourPop Mandalorian palette. And then for the shade Ice Cold, I will do this shade from the Odin's Eye Christmas Eve palette, which is called Snowflake. All right, and then we've got the shade Say It Out Loud, which is a very taupey colored matte, which you would think would be pretty easy to find in my palette collection, but you never know. I immediately thought of the Odin's Eye Sea Talk palette in collaboration with Lauren May Beauty and this taupey matte over here called Dolphin Tail. I think it's got the right kind of like mushroomy undertone to it. It might be a little deep because I think this is meant to be like a transition shade, but honestly, going off of the swatches on the ColourPop website, it looks pretty spot on. So I'm gonna go ahead and commit to that one for the Say It Out Loud dupe. For the next shade, the Cullens, this is another one of those blue to purpley duochromes. I'm actually going to keep out the Sea Talk palette and I'm going to go into this shade Ocean Jewel right here. I think this is actually going to be perfect for this shade. You can see even just from the finger swatch how brightly the blue shift shines. And that's pretty much exactly what the ColourPop swatch looks like. So that's actually a really, really close one. So I am going to pick Ocean Jewel as my dupe for the Cullens. Next up we have the shade Lion and Lamb, which is the shade that my eye immediately went to in this palette. It's the really bright kind of shifty green shade. It shifts from a deeper green to a really bright green. I've got a couple of options that came to mind, but I want to try and capture, if I can, the undertone of this one. Like this shade in the Michaela and Glamlight Part 2 palette called Grateful is really close, but it's a little bit more cool toned, and this is much more of like a yellowy green. Same goes with the shade New Year from the Odin's Eye Merry Christmas palette. I mean, this one's pretty dang close, so I might come back to this one if I don't find another option. But this one just is a little bit too tealy for what I think this shade is going for. I wonder if Moss from the Beauty Bay and Wilderness palette would be a little bit more limey. Yeah, that's definitely close because it's got a bit of like a gold reflect to it. That might be my best bet. I have one other idea though, so I'm just gonna get that one out. So this is the Revolution Pro Earth and Stone palette, and this is supposed to be a dupe for the Pat McGrath I always forget. The Subliminal, the one that has the green in it, and this is the green that I always think of when I think of like a green shimmer shade. So I'm gonna give this one a swatch and see which one might be the closest of the two. So pretty. I love an emerald green shimmer so much. Okay, so the one on top is from the Beauty Bay Wilderness palette, and the one on the bottom is from the Revolution Pro palette. To be honest, I think you could go with either one of these. I mean, the Revolution Pro shade definitely has more of like the murky, kind of deeper tone that the one in the ColourPop one has, but then the one from the Beauty Bay and Wilderness palette definitely has more of the gold leaning shift to it. I think I'm gonna go with the Wilderness shade just because I feel like that gold shift is gonna be really a key to achieving the overall like vibe of the palette. But really, honestly, I think either of them would work just fine. I think because that Wilderness shade has a tiny bit of blue in the reflect, it might just lend itself better to the overall color story. So that's what I'm gonna go with for now. And then next we have the shade 17, which is like a really unique, sagey, but kind of tealy green matte. The trick with this one is not to go too olivey because it's the same kind of mid-toned saturation as a lot of my olive mattes, but it's definitely more cool toned overall. I'm gonna grab Untamed from the ABH Subculture palette. This might be too dark. Yeah, I think this one's gonna be a little too dark and a little bit too olivey. Oh, that shade does not swatch well, does it? But close, close. Let's try Forest from the Wilderness palette. Yeah, that one's gonna be a little bit too bright and too green. Ah, here we go. The shade New Leaf from the Odin's Eye Merry Christmas palette. This one might be a little bit lighter, but it might be the exact undertone I'm looking for. It's definitely not as muted as the shade in the ColourPop palette, but it might be the closest one that I personally have. That's a pretty unique shade, and I have to say it looks a lot different in the pan than it does in the swatch. The swatch seems a lot deeper and a lot more teal. What about the shade Axis from the Subculture palette? Okay, it's definitely deeper, and again, the swatches from this palette it's just not great. But in terms of the color, I think it might actually be the closest. Like if you look at it kind of blended out here, I think that's the closest one we've got. I think that's gonna be the winner. Yeah, it's just gonna have to be applied kind of lightly to match the saturation, but in terms of the undertone, that one I think is gonna be the closest. I am surprised by how niche and exact some of these shades are, like I have to say. I did a Duping the Vibes video of the Natasha Denona Yucca palette last year, and finding shades for that was like a piece of cake compared to this. So maybe in that way I should give some props to ColourPop for, I don't know, doing a pretty innovative color story and not just repeating the same shades that all of us have a million times in our collections. But that being said, I think you can get a close enough dupe probably, especially if you have a lot of the palettes I've been mentioning, to where you definitely don't need to purchase the palette, but it's just interesting to see that they are kind of, I don't know, formulating new undertones of similar tones that we've seen before. So it's creating a different effect overall. And then we have another silver. I'm looking at the shade Moonlit, by the way. This one is slightly deeper than the rest. It definitely has a bit more of like a murky gray base to it, but still, I mean, this is a lot of silvers. Let's look at the Star Wars Mandalorian again. I think this one is a little bit more taupey. To be fair, in the swatch, this does look more like a taupe than a straight silver, but in the pictures that they have up of the pan, it literally just looks like another silver. Let's try Imperial Credit from the Mandalorian. That one's a really nice taupey, silvery shade. I'm not sure how well you're gonna be able to see that in the swatch. It might even need a touch more brown in it actually. So I'm gonna go back and pull out the Odin's Eye Sea Talk palette and the shade Smoky Pearl. My only reservation with this one is that it sometimes can pull purple. And this one doesn't seem to have any purple to it. So that one, you can kind of see it has a little bit of a purpley base, although overall it is a taupe. Kind of a random one, but I'm gonna try the shade Libra from the ABH and Carly Bible palette, because this one is a taupe for sure. Might lean a little bit too bronzy for what we want though. There's Libra swatched there. I kind of need a cross between these two colors. Like less purpley than this, but not quite this gray and not quite this bronze. What about Underground from the Beauty Bay and Nikki Tutorials palette? Let's see. So I swatched that one right in between here. Pretty close. We're getting close. Okay, I had to let my camera battery charge, so while that was happening, I went ahead and took off my current eye look just to save time for when I put on the eye look for this video, so apologies that I suddenly look scary. So picking up where we left off with that shade Moonlit, I'm still not quite pleased with any of these options. Okay, I just tried swatching that shade Underground from the Beauty Bay and Nikki Tutorials palette over like a little bit of a wet base. And I think that is going to be the one. I think it just wasn't picking up as well in my initial swatch, but this has the perfect amount of like that taupey undertone with a really bright silvery shine to it. So that is the one that I'm going to go with for Moonlit. Then we have the shade Impossibly Fast, and I'm pretty confident that I have the perfect shade for this one from the Beauty Bay Wilderness palette. The shade Ivy right here is a really, really deep green, but it's got a tiny, tiny bit of like a tealy evergreen to it. I think the ColourPop is a touch more muted, but this is just about spot on for that shade, so I'm gonna take that one. The shade Bella is a really cool toned matte brown. So I'm thinking again of the Mandalorian palette and this shade here called This Is the Way. It might be a touch too gray, but let's take a look. Yeah, that one's a little bit too gray. It needs to have some more brown to it. Potentially the shade Boy from ABH Carly Bible. Closer, but maybe a little bit too warm. Let's see Tender from I Need a Nude, which is this one here. Maybe if I build it up a bit. That one's definitely getting us closer. Here again though, I almost need a cross between these two shades because this is still pulling a little bit warm. Okay, I'm thinking about the shade Prohibition from the Beauty Bay Age of Opulence palette. Oh, that one's even warmer than the Natasha Denona. So I think I'm gonna go with the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette and this shade Tender because I think it's just the coolest of my options without going all the way into gray territory. Okay, just a few more. We've just got 3 more. So 2 more shimmers and 1 matte. So the shade Irresistible is the 3rd of those kind of duochrome blue to purple shades, but this one has the least amount of purple to it. It's more of just like a sparkly kind of cool toned navy-ish. Actually, going back to the Carly Bible palette, I wonder if one of these 2 shades would work. I'm gonna try the shade Jode. Hey, that actually could be pretty spot on. It's got the right kind of navy base with a really pretty shift to it. Let's try the shade OA just to cover our bases because I feel like these are pretty similar. OA just has a little bit more of like a rainbow sparkle effect to it. The top one is Jode, the bottom one is OA. I think either of these could work, but I'm gonna go with Jode just because it looks slightly more muted and more silvery, which I think is a little bit more in tune with this color story. Okay, so we've got Irrevocably, which is a mid-tone kind of matte dark periwinkle shade, and then Forever Young, which is a sparkly black. So for Irrevocably, I'm thinking of the Glamlight Retro Raggy palette and this shade here, which is kind of like that deeper version of a periwinkle. That looks pretty close. It could use a touch more gray to it, but it's pretty close. There's also one in the Glamlight and Michaela Part 2 palette. This one's called 2021. So let me just swatch that. Yeah, I think the one from the Scooby-Doo palette is the right depth. But you know me, I have to go in and check everything before I commit. There's also this shade Imagine from the Glamlight and Barbie palette. That's a lot more rich and too blue. So I think I was actually on the right track with the first one that I swatched. Yeah, I think I was on track with that first one. So I'm gonna take this shade from the Glamlight Scooby-Doo palette. And last but not least, we have the shade Forever Young, which is a sparkly black. Now, I have to say, I don't tend to reach for sparkly black. I'm much more of a matte black shadow user. So yeah, if there was a hint of like navy or something to it, I could probably dupe that pretty easily, but from what I can tell, it looks pretty true black, just with some sparkle to it. Worst comes to worst, I'll just use a matte black and I think it'll serve basically the same purpose, but I'm just going to double check all my palettes here and see if I've got a sparkly black anywhere. Yep, I don't have a sparkly black anywhere, at least not from any of these palettes in front of me, so I'm just going to take Blackest Black from the Glamlight and Michaela Part 2 palette, which is, yeah, boring, but serves pretty much the same purpose when it comes to an actual eye look, at least in the way that I would probably use that shade in the palette. Okay, so finally I have all of my shades picked out. I'm going to show you the color story swatched out on my arm, and then we will do an eye look. All right, I have zoomed you in, so let's do an eye look. I think this palette just really calls for a two-toned blue and green eye. So I think what I'm going to do is put blue on the inside and green on the outside. So I'm going to start with the lightest blue matte called Unconditionally, which for me comes from the Nikkie Tutorials palette with Beauty Bay, and it's this shade right here called Plot Twist. And I'm just gonna put that in the inner part of my crease. It's a really, really light shade, so I'm actually gonna grab a denser brush to see if I can get more payoff. There we go. And then to deepen that up a little bit, I'm gonna take the shade Irrevocably, which for me comes from the Glamlight and Scooby-Doo palette. And it's just this kind of deeper periwinkle matte shade here. And I'm just gonna start deepening things up in the inner half of my eye. I might dip back into Plot Twist just to blend out that edge there. Obviously, I'm not gonna be able to use all of the shades in the palette in this one eye look, but I'm gonna use as many as I can. Especially the shades that I feel like really capture the overall vibe of the palette. So going in with those blues and greens. All right, and then for the outer half of my crease, I'm gonna go in with the shade 17, which for me comes from the ABH Subculture palette, and it's the shade Axis, I believe. Now I'm second guessing myself. I think it was the shade Axis. And I actually was playing around with my swatches while my battery camera was charging, and I mixed this shade with a little bit of the shade Forest from the Beauty Bay Wilderness palette, and I felt like that gave a really true dupe for the shade in the palette. That is all going on very pigmented, much more pigmented than I expected. So I'm just taking a clean brush and I'm gonna blend out that edge slightly. I think this shade in the ColourPop palette would go on a little bit more muted. So I'm just gonna try to diffuse that a little bit. I might even go back in with that shade from the Nikkie Tutorials palette, Basic Truth, just to help blend out those edges and also blend the two shades into each other. Just blending those together right in the middle. Okay, and then I'm gonna go in with the shade Impossibly Fast, which for me comes from the Wilderness palette and the shade Ivy. I'm just going to deepen up the outer corner with that. I'm actually going to take a little bit of Forever Young, which is the black. So for my dupe, I used the Glamlight and Michaela Part 2, the shade Blackest Black. But in the swatches, I actually layered a little bit of glazed over the top just to give it a little bit of a sparkle to kind of capture the same effect. But I'm just going to grab the smallest little dab of that and deepen out the outer corner even more, just because I feel like I want this to be less vibrant and a little bit more moody to capture the vibe of the palette. So I'm just deepening things up. Okay, time for shimmer. So I'm gonna take the shade Irresistible, which for me comes from the Carly Bible palette and the shade Jode. And I'm actually gonna put that on my inner corner, so creating almost a little bit of a halo shape to the eyes. That shade is so pretty. Okay, and then I'm going to go in with the shade The Cullens, which for me comes from the Odin's Eye Sea Talk palette and the shade Ocean Jewel. And I'm just going to put that right next to that shade that we just put down and switch back and forth to blend them together. Super pretty. And then I'm going to take the green shimmer. So in the palette, it's called Lion and Lamb. For me, it comes from the Wilderness palette and the shade Moss. And I'm just putting that right on the outer portion of my lid. And then I'll just take a little bit more of Ocean Jewel in the center to blend those together. And then I think just for fun and for some extra sparkle, I'm going to take the shade Edward, which for me comes from the Beauty Bay and Jade Thirlwall palette, and the shade Confetti, that really light icy blue shimmer shade. And I'm just going to put that right in the center, kind of where the blue and the green meet, to just add a little bit of extra dimension and sparkle. Okay, so for the lower lash line, I'm going to go in with the shade Impossibly Fast, which for me is Ivy from the Wilderness palette again. It's the same dark green matte that I used in my outer corner. Okay, and then on my finger, I'm going to take the shade Moss, which is my dupe for Lion and Lamb. Just going to put that on the majority of my lower lash line just to bring some of the green back in. And then on the inner corner, I'm going to take one of the silvers. So I'm going to do my shade for Prom Night, which comes from the Odin's Eye Christmas Eve palette, and it's the shade Snowflake. And put it right in this inner corner area. And then I'll take a little more of Edward, or my shade is Confetti from the Jade palette, and I'm going to put that in the inner corner on the top. So pretty. I love that shade. I might just take a little bit of that Confetti shade in between the silver and the green on the bottom too, just to kind of blend those together. All right, and here is the eye look. It's definitely wintry and icy and very forest vibes. I know they came out with a couple of liners in this collection as well. They were liquid liners, and I don't have any of those, but I do have some pencil liners in the kind of corresponding shades. So I know there was a black one. I think most of us have a black liner laying around. There was a green one. This is the Catrice 20-Hour Ultra Precision in Warm Green, which will probably be what I use in my waterline today. And then I also have a wine color, kind of like the one that they released. This is the ColourPop Cream Gel Liner in the shade Joyride. So I already kind of had those general shades in my collection. I feel like warm green makes the most sense to go with this look, so I'm just going to put that in my waterline. Ooh, and my eye is watering, so eyeshadow does not want to stick to that area, but that's okay. Let me go put some mascara on and then I will come back to finish up the face and do lips with you and give you my final thoughts. Okay, and here is the look with mascara on. I did just want to do highlighter and lips with you because I have a couple of products that are really similar to some of the products that were released as part of the collection. They released a Super Shock highlighter in this collection called Meadow, which is described as an opalescent duochrome lavender with multi-dimensional pinpoints. And I can sort of dupe the vibes of that highlighter with my Kaleidos Moon Cruiser, which is pretty much exactly what they said. It's an opalescent highlighter with some lavender shifts to it. It does have a little bit of blue as well, but I think for the sake of duping the vibes, this one will be similar enough. Hopefully that shows up in the camera and you can see the kind of lavender shift to it. Obviously the Super Shock one is going to be that classic Super Shock formula that's a little bit more like squishy and more of like a cream, and it's also $10, which is cheaper than the Kaleidos one. So if you're looking for a highlighter like this at an affordable price point, then that's a good way to go. But I don't need the ColourPop one because I've already got this one in my collection and I feel like they've got to be pretty similar, right? They also released a couple of lip oils in this collection, which look so fun. There's a dark burgundy reddish one, there's a blue one which looks really cool, and then there's a black one which is called Team Jacob. I have a black lip gloss from Izamaya. This one is actually a plumping formula, which is not my preference when it comes to lip products, so I'm actually a little bit tempted by the Team Jacob lip oil just because it wouldn't be plumping, it wouldn't have that tingling effect, but I felt like I had to wear this one in this video to complete the vibes. So I'm just gonna line my lips quickly with my NYX Suede Matte Lip Liner in the shade Moonwalk, which is a really cool toned liner shade. And then I'm going to go in with my dupe for the Team Jacob Luxe Lip Oil, which is the Izamaya Lip Black Maximizing Lip Serum in the shade Black Veil. And that is everything for this video. I feel like I've come out with a really beautiful look, if not maybe a touch more punchy of a look than the general vibes from the ColourPop and Twilight eyeshadow palette, but I think overall you can definitely get a similar look if you have blues and greens in your collection. There are some really specific, special kind of niche shades and undertones in this palette. Sometimes you look at a palette release and you're like, I can definitely dupe that, and other times it's a little bit more of a challenge, and this was definitely one of those times. But that being said, if you're on a no-buy, if you don't want to buy the ColourPop one for whatever reason, or you just don't know how much use you would get out of a palette like that, look around in your palette collection and see if there's some greeny, bluey, kind of murky shades that could give you potentially a similar look. I had a lot of fun doing this video and creating this look with you all today. It's always satisfying to dupe the vibes of a new palette release and just remind myself how much eyeshadow I actually have. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you would like to see more duping the vibes style videos from me, make sure you subscribe. You can also let me know in the comments down below if there are any other new palette releases you would like to see me try to dupe with what I have in my collection. And other than that, I will see you in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.